In February of 2015, the Scottsdale, Arizona community was shaken by a crime that seemed impossible to reconcile. It was both incredibly brutal and almost surgically calculated.
We're talking about the murder of Allison Feldman, a 31-year-old medical professional, killed inside her own home.
And for 3 long, frustrating years, this case just went completely cold. The police had everything and nothing.
Right, they had the killer's full DNA profile, a perfect genetic fingerprint,
Hmm.
but they couldn't put a name to it.
The entire investigation was basically frozen in time, stalled by 2 huge factors. A killer who was a ghost, not in any criminal database, and a crime scene that was so meticulously cleaned, it seemed to defy, all traditional forensics.
And that's really what we're diving into today. This isn't just about one case. We're doing a definitive examination of how this single cold case forced a fundamental change in Arizona law in its forensic science.
This deep dive feels unique because it forces you, the listener, to look right at the collision point between this cutting-edge, almost futuristic technology.
Familial DNA searching.
Exactly. That technology and the fundamental privacy protections guaranteed to every citizen by the Fourth Amendment.
Our sources show an investigation that found its big break in, well, probably the most unlikely and legally dangerous way possible.
It's incredible. Investigators were led to the suspect, a man named Ian Mitchum, not through a direct match of his own DNA.
No, not at all. It was because his incarcerated brother's genetic profile was just close enough to his to generate a lead, a familial lead.
But the real story, the part that makes this a landmark case, it really begins after that.
Oh, absolutely. Because the investigation then zeroed in on a piece of evidence that, for all legal intents and purposes, should have been dead for 3 years.
A single vial of Ian Mitchum's blood.
Drawn for a completely unrelated DUI arrest that happened a month before the murder.
And the extraordinary legal battle that followed over whether the police could just repurpose that old blood. I mean, that fight is the crucible of this entire deep dive. It went all the way to the Arizona Supreme Court.
So our mission today is to move beyond the simple timeline. We're going to go in slow motion here, meticulously examining the forensic countermeasures used at the scene, the profound political advocacy that actually fueled the breakthrough.
And the really granular legal reasoning that ultimately decided if the evidence was even admissible, all under this extremely complex legal idea called the inevitable discovery doctrine.
For you, the listener, this is the shortcut to understanding the precise modern tension between our right to genetic privacy and the absolute necessity of pursuing justice.
And to frame this whole discussion, here's that initial nugget of pure insight you need to hold on to.
The case was solved entirely because Ian Mitchum's brother was already in the state's DNA database.
This isn't just a success story. It is now officially recognized as the first successful use of familial DNA in Arizona's history.
And that set a benchmark, a new standard, for every single future cold case investigation in the state.
So let's begin with Allison Feldman, because to really understand the violence of her end, you have to understand the vibrancy of her life.
She was 31 years old, a Scottsdale resident, but originally from Minnesota. A very successful and, by all accounts, incredibly dedicated medical professional.
She was a burn and trauma specialist for a Swedish medical supply company, Mölnlycke.
Right, and her commitment wasn't some, typical 9-to-5 job. Our sources note that she was frequently traveling to trauma centers.
Sometimes driving for hours, right?
Exactly. Down to Tucson on weekends, for instance, just to personally deliver specialized dressings or supplies that were needed for a specific patient's care. She was a focused, organized, and deeply proactive person whose life really was centered on helping others.
So the crime happens in mid-February 2015 at her home near Loop 101 and Pima Road.
And the timeline is tight. The last known contact anyone had with her was February 17th, 2015. So we have a very clear window for the crime.
And the discovery is made the very next day, February 18th.
Her boyfriend, Alex Sokoladov, who you might see referred to as Alex Stone in some reports, he becomes intensely concerned.
She's not responding to texts, not answering calls.
Exactly. So he uses his key to enter the home. And what he walked into was, it was just pure horror. But it was horror layered with this chilling, calculated element.
The testimony that came out years later at trial described just absolute brutality.
She was found nude, she had been beaten, she was strangled.
There was a very clear ligature mark around her neck, wasn't there? Indicating a cord or something similar was used.
Yes, a clear ligature mark. And she had been sexually assaulted, including with a broken beer bottle.
She was found lying supine in the hallway, and she was partially obscured by a rug that had been moved.
First responders also noted that a black dress had been draped over her head and shoulders.
But the one thing, the singular defining characteristic of that scene, The factor that immediately took this investigation to a whole other level of complexity.
Was the chemical interference.
The smell.
The smell. Alex Stone testified about an overwhelming and pervasive odor of cleaning agents the second he opened that door.
So the killer had systematically doused parts of the home, specifically with these highly caustic agents, most likely chlorine bleach.
And the police realized very quickly this was a sophisticated, a meticulous attempt to sterilize the scene and just erase all traces of the crime.
That is an enormous hurdle for any forensic team. This wasn't some messy, panicked wipe down. This was a forensically aware countermeasure.
That's the perfect way to put it. Okay, so can we go deeper into the mechanics of this? Why was this such a monumental challenge for forensics?
Let's do it. So oxidizing agents like chlorine bleach are literally designed to chemically shred biological material.
We're talking about breaking down protein chains, cellular structures, the oils and amino acids left behind in latent fingerprints.
Essentially, it just causes the cellular components of blood and semen to just break down. It oxidizes the DNA itself, and it makes traditional fingerprint dust completely useless.
So this meticulous cleanup meant that initially the police could find 0 usable fingerprints. None.
Which means the Scottsdale police and their forensic teams had to immediately shift into like a crisis mode.
Almost like a salvage operation.
Right. They treated the entire 5-day initial processing period from February 18th to the 23rd like they were trying to recover data from a corrupted hard drive.
And they ended up collecting over 400 pieces of evidence in that time.
So how did they even begin to salvage biological evidence when the killer had basically bathed the crime scene in bleach?
They had to fall back on specialized, highly sensitive chemical reagents. And sources confirmed the critical use of a substance called Blue Star.
Blue Star. I think most people have heard of luminol from crime shows. Is it similar?
It's similar, but it's considered a more advanced chemiluminescent reagent. It's known to be more effective on blood that's been heavily diluted or, in this case, cleaned.
So when they apply it in the dark,
It reacts to the trace elements of hemoglobin that the bleach couldn't completely destroy, and it glows this very faint blue.
so the chlorine may have destroyed all the visible evidence, but it couldn't get rid of every single molecule of hemoglobin.
Precisely. And by using Blue Star, they managed to detect these trace blood stains that had survived the chemical assault.
And crucially, these stains weren't just inside the home.
No, that's a critical point. They found them on the cool deck of the patio and near the swimming pool.
Which suggested the attacker was very likely injured himself.
Right, maybe cut by the broken glass from the beer bottle, or maybe from defensive scratches from Allison. And as he moved around outside during the cleanup or his escape, he was leaving these tiny, invisible droplets of his own blood behind.
And that injury hypothesis, that was so critical because amid all that chaos and cleanup, detectives were able to recover 3 separate DNA samples.
3 samples that they believed belonged to the perpetrator.
And that recovery was the single most important element of the entire case, wasn't it?
It was everything. Because despite this monumental effort to destroy the evidence, they were able to develop a full, clean, male DNA profile of this unknown killer.
And they had it within days of the murder.
Yes. And this profile became the ghost that they would hunt for the next 3 years.
Okay, so beyond that crucial DNA, what else did that initial 5-day sweep turn up? Because the motive was immediately a huge question mark.
It really was. The presence of stolen items complicated the narrative in a big way. Allison's Tiffany bracelet was missing, her iPhone 6, and several of her credit cards.
Which points to robbery.
It hints at robbery, yes. But the extreme level of violence and the meticulous cleanup afterward, that strongly suggested a calculated cover-up for something more spontaneous, more personal, or a sexual attack.
So the question was the robbery the point of the crime, or was it just window dressing, an attempt to mislead investigators?
And that question just lingered for years.
And the physical evidence of the cleanup itself became part of the investigation.
Oh, absolutely. Investigators collected a mop that they found at the scene, which they believed was used in the cleanup.
And the broken neck of that beer bottle.
Right, which was used in the assault.
Yeah.
But the rest of the bottle was gone.
Which suggests the suspect might have taken it with him, specifically to prevent them from recovering fingerprints or more biological traces from it.
It points to that same forensic awareness we talked about.
And at the same time this physical search is going on, the digital forensics team had to step in immediately, especially since Allison's phone was gone.
Lieutenant Kevin Kwan was in charge of that. He oversaw the data extraction from her other devices, laptops, tablets, and these really comprehensive searches of all her social media.
Instagram, LinkedIn.
Dating platforms, too. Match.com, plenty offish. The goal was to reconstruct her final timeline, to look for any potential online contacts, dates she might have gone on, any threats she might have received.
Especially since the initial theory was that she probably knew her killer.
Exactly. But despite this really intensive digital autopsy, nothing came of it. No immediate actionable links to a suspect ever emerged.
So the detectives were in this incredibly frustrating position. They had the killer's genetic fingerprint, his complete DNA profile, but when they ran it through the National CODIS database
It came up empty.
and the investigative dead ends, they started piling up almost immediately.
In that first month, police were still working on the theory that Allison knew her killer.
Which, it probably provided some comfort to the broader Scottsdale community, the idea that this wasn't just some random predator on the loose.
But that theory just crumbled pretty quickly. Every known associate, every friend, every family member, they all provided ironclad alibis or were cleared through DNA testing.
And so that terrifying possibility of a random predator just reemerged right as the certainty grew that this killer was simply not in the system.
The scale of that dead end is really staggering. They pursued hundreds of tips. They ran that full DNA profile over and over again through CODIS, through NDIS.
And month after month, year after year.
Nothing. No match. The killer's DNA was like a genetic island, completely unconnected to any of the federal criminal databases.
We should take a moment to acknowledge the community response here, which was pretty unusual.
It was. Sources noted that dozens of neighbors actually came forward and proactively volunteered their own DNA samples.
Just to help the police eliminate them as suspects.
Right. That level of cooperation is really rare, and it just shows you the profound anxiety in that community and also the deep desire to help solve this case.
But even with that collective effort, the case officially went cold.
Allison's father, Harley Feldman, he later described this whole period as just an absolute nightmare of uncertainty.
You can only imagine. They had the one piece of evidence that should have led to an arrest, but the technology just wasn't quite advanced enough or maybe legally available enough to use it yet.
And that frustration, the frustration of having the key but not being able to find the door, that's what led the Feldmans to make this monumental pivot.
They recognized that traditional methods were completely exhausted, so they began advocating intensely. They moved into the political arena to try and force a technological change.
And this political push was truly the engine that broke this case wide open. By late 2017, that's nearly 3 years after the murder.
The family was specifically lobbying for the use of this revolutionary familial DNA searching.
Which was, a very politically fraught topic at the time. It was highly restricted, and Arizona had never once successfully used it.
So walk us through the catalyst for that. How does one family manage to force a statewide forensic policy shift?
It was driven by just sheer, focused tenacity and, honestly, a chance meeting.
The pivot really began when Allison's mother, Elaine Feldman, met a former Arizona state legislator named Barbara Leff.
And they met during a trip abroad, of all places, specifically to Israel and Poland back in 2016.
And Leff was just deeply moved by their story, by the unsolved case.
She was, and she immediately leveraged her vast network of political contacts. She focused her efforts on the Attorney General at the time, Mark Brnovich, and on key people at the Department of Public Safety, the DPS lab.
So the argument they were making wasn't just, please solve our daughter's case. It had to be bigger than that.
Oh, it was much bigger. The argument was, the time has come for Arizona to responsibly adopt this powerful forensic tool, regardless of the controversy, because this is the only way forward on cases like this.
They were essentially arguing for a kind of legislative and ethical courage.
Precisely. And that effort culminated in a really significant political commitment. Harley Feldman recalled the assistant police chief making him a solemn promise. He said, "I'm going to call you when I have a solution to this crime."
Oh.
The family's persistent pressure, it essentially bypassed all the traditional bureaucratic reluctance, and it forced the state to use this politically sensitive tool that required personal high-level approval from the Attorney General himself.
So Allison's case became the test run, the flagship case for familial DNA in the state of Arizona.
With those political barriers finally lowered, the scientists at the Arizona DPS Crime Lab, they began this highly arduous process of the familial DNA search.
And this wasn't, just clicking another button on the CODIS computer. This was a painstaking, complex hunt designed to find a ghost by looking through his family tree.
This is the massive central part of the story, so we really need to zero in on the forensic distinction here. Our audience is knowledgeable, so let's go beyond just saying CODIS is an exact match and familial is a partial match.
Okay, let's do it. Let's go deeper into the mechanics of this specific DPS search. What were the statistical hurdles they had to overcome?
Okay, so if CODIS is like searching for a specific unique key that fits one specific lock, a perfect 13 to 20 allele signature match, then familial searching is more like calculating the probability that two different keys were made from the same original blank.
So you're not looking for identity, you're looking for similarity.
Statistical patterns of similarity. You run the unknown DNA profile from the crime scene through the state's database, looking for patterns that suggest a close biological relationship, usually a first-degree relative, a brother, a father, or a son.
And the mechanics of that are based on these kinship likelihood models.
Right. The DPS scientists had to use this highly intricate mathematical modeling. They're quantifying the number of shared genetic characteristics, or alleles, between the unknown profile and the hundreds of thousands of profiles of convicted offenders already in their database.
And then the system calculates something called a rarity index.
A rarity index or a kinship likelihood, yes. They're not looking for a perfect 13 allele match. They might be looking for, say, a 9 or 10 allele match, and then calculating the statistical improbability that this similarity is just due to random chance rather than biological kinship.
And because they were running a male profile from the scene, I assume the Y chromosome analysis played a pretty big role.
It often does, since it's passed down almost exclusively through the father's line. The whole process is designed to create a prioritized short list of potential family members for the police to then investigate.
And it's so important to stress that last part. The final result is never a conclusive identification.
Never. It only provides a lead, a very strong lead, but just a lead.
The necessary legal next step is just good old-fashioned police work. Investigators have to then surveil or legally compel a sample from that narrowed-down relative to get a definitive comparison profile.
And that lead arrived in January of 2018.
The search generated a partial match to a man named Mark Mitchum.
Mark Mitchum was an incarcerated offender. He was already serving time for an unrelated crime, and supplemental reports identify him as a convicted child molester.
The common genetic markers suggested the killer was indeed a close male relative, so investigators immediately focused on Mark's brother.
Ian Mitchum. At the time, he was 42 years old, a local man. He lived in Phoenix, only a few miles from Allison's home.
And significantly, he had a recent arrest record in Scottsdale, so he was already on the local police radar, even for just minor incidents.
And this is where we get to the eureka moment. There was also, at the same time, a profound constitutional violation. This is the breach of privacy that defines the entire rest of the case.
Detectives pull Ian Mitchum's history, and they discover that 1 month before Allison's murder, back in January 2015, he was arrested for a DUI in Scottsdale.
And as part of the routine procedure for that DUI, 2 vials of his blood were drawn.
But they were drawn specifically for chemical testing, right? To determine alcohol concentration or drug content per Arizona statute.
Exactly. And here's the critical detail. There was a signed destruction notice. Those samples were supposed to be destroyed after 90 days.
But through some administrative error or just simple neglect, the Scottsdale police still had the second vial of Ian's blood. It was sitting in their evidence freezer 3 years later in 2018.
And the breach was immediate, and it was intentional. The police, armed with this brand new familial DNA lead from Mark Mitchum, they retrieved Ian's old, legally expired DUI blood vials.
And without getting a new warrant, they just proceeded to extract a full DNA profile for their murder investigation.
And court records confirm this was the definitive breakthrough. The profile they generated from that second vial of DUI blood, it matched the profile found at the scene of the crime.
With essentially 100% certainty.
Matching in every genetic marker. The years-long hunt was over, solved by a forgotten vial of blood that, by all rights, should have been discarded years earlier.
So Ian Mitchum, then 42, working at a local deli, he was arrested on April 10th, 2018.
He was charged with first-degree murder, sexual assault, and burglary. And the police, their confidence was absolute.
All right, let's take that 5-minute pedantic dive into the motive and the suspect profile. Investigators said they were 100% confident in the identity of the killer because of that DNA match.
But, and this is a huge but, they found absolutely no personal link between Ian Mitchum and Allison Feldman.
He denied ever knowing her. He denied ever being in her home.
And investigators, they couldn't find any connection. Not through digital trails, no mutual friends, no work overlap, nothing.
So this completely transforms the narrative. This isn't a personal vendetta or some targeted crime anymore. This becomes a chilling, random act of violence. Mitchum was a stranger.
Exactly. And we really have to analyze the paradox this presents for a profiler. On one hand, the crime itself was explosive and it seemed spontaneous. The brutality, the use of the beer bottle as a weapon, the clear signs of a violent struggle.
All of that suggests a random eruption of violence, a crime of opportunity.
But on the other hand, the immediate systematic dousing of the scene with chlorine bleach, the removal of the rest of that broken bottle, the disposal of items in the pool, that suggests a killer who had the presence of mind and maybe even prior experience or forensic awareness to attempt a comprehensive, almost professional level cover-up.
It's this bizarre dichotomy of a spontaneous, violent outburst followed immediately by a calculated forensic neutralization.
And that combination creates a particularly difficult profile for a defense attorney to challenge.
It's a huge obstacle. I mean, how do you argue against 100% DNA evidence when your client has no alibi, no explanation for why his blood is at the scene, and no credible alternative theory?
You can't. The argument has to shift entirely away from the facts of the crime and onto procedural grounds, contamination, or in this case, legal suppression of the evidence.
Because the prosecution's theory that Mitchum randomly targeted Feldman committed this act of spontaneous violence and then immediately went into cleanup mode. It's terrifyingly simple, and it's forensically effective.
It leaves the DNA as the sole, unassailable link between the man and the murder.
So despite that definitive forensic match, the defense immediately challenged the admissibility of the DNA evidence.
Their argument was that the 2018 warrantless extraction and analysis of that 2015 blood sample was illegally obtained. It was the fruit of the poisonous tree.
And the initial court, the Maricopa County Superior Court, in December of 2022, actually agreed with them. They suppressed the evidence.
And that single ruling threatened to completely derail the entire decade-long investigation.
This is where the legal mechanics really become the absolute center of this deep dive. The issue wasn't whether the police lawfully possessed the physical vial itself.
No, the question was whether they could lawfully use the contents of that vial for a completely new, unrelated purpose, years after the fact, without a warrant.
The core conflict really revolved around the scope of consent and, I guess, the very definition of a search under the Fourth Amendment.
Right. Mitchum had explicitly consented to that 2015 DUI blood draw, but only for the specific purpose of determining alcohol concentration or drug content, just as the Arizona law dictates.
The state's initial position was pretty simple. If we lawfully possess the physical evidence, we should be free to analyze it however we want, using whatever new techniques come along.
But the Arizona Supreme Court, in its landmark decision on December 17, 2024, led by Chief Justice Ann Timmer, they drew a very hard line on that claim.
And what specific legal precedent did they use to determine that processing that blood for DNA was actually a new search?
They upheld a state precedent set in a 2012 case called Mario W.V. Caipio.
And that case established a really critical distinction.
It did. It established that processing a biological sample to extract a complete, highly intimate DNA profile constitutes a separate search. It's an entirely new intrusion into a person's privacy that is distinct from the initial physical collection of the blood.
It's like the difference between looking at the color of a liquid in a vial versus decoding the entire genetic blueprint of the person it came from.
That's a great analogy.
Yeah.
And it's a significant victory for individual privacy then.
Yeah.
The court is effectively saying that just because you hand over a bodily fluid for a limited, specific test, it doesn't mean you have forfeited all future privacy rights to that sample.
And the court was pretty blunt about it.
They were. They emphatically rejected the state's position. They reasoned that a reasonable person consenting to a DUI blood test would never understand that their consent extended to creating a full DNA profile years later for an unrelated capital murder investigation.
The court noted plainly that Mitchum did not lose all of his privacy rights in that blood, even though the state lawfully possessed the physical vials.
So extracting that full profile without a new warrant exceeded the limited scope of his original consent, which made the 2018 search unreasonable and a clear violation of the Fourth Amendment.
So the DNA was obtained illegally, full stop. But we know the story doesn't end there.
No, it doesn't. The court then pivoted to this complex legal parachute called the inevitable discovery doctrine, which allowed the evidence to be used anyway.
Okay, can we go deeper into the mechanics of inevitable discovery here? How did Mitchum's later, completely unrelated criminal convictions, years after this violation, actually save the murder case. It seems so counterintuitive.
It really does. But this is both the genius and the defrustration of the inevitable discovery doctrine, which was established by the U.S. Supreme Court in a case called Nix v. Williams.
And it allows illegally obtained evidence to be admitted if the prosecution can prove that evidence would have been inevitably discovered through lawful means anyway.
Exactly. And the key is, the state had to prove this using verifiable historical facts that were totally independent of the illegal 2018 search.
And the verifiable historical facts were Mitchum's own subsequent criminal behavior.
Correct. The crucial statutory detail here is another Arizona law, ARS Section 13610.
While this murder investigation was pending, and years after the illegal 2018 search, Mitchum was convicted of separate, unrelated felonies in 2022.
Specifically narcotics and some additional DUI charges, which resulted in significant prison sentences.
And under that specific Arizona law, anyone convicted of a felony and sentenced to the Arizona Department of Corrections, Rehabilitation, and Reentry, the ADCRR, is mandated to provide a DNA sample.
It's required. It's for profiling and entry into the state identification system and CODIS.
So the court's reasoning was, with legal certainty, that if the illegal 2018 search had not happened,
ADCRR would have been legally required to collect a DNA sample from him after his 2022 sentencing, and it would have yielded the exact identical DNA profile.
and the only reason the prison system didn't take a sample in 2022 was because the police already had his profile illegally in their system from 2018.
Exactly. So the court determined that suppressing the evidence would actually put the prosecution in a worse position than they would have been in if the police had just followed the law in the first place.
So the unconstitutional search was essentially forgiven, retroactively, by the defendant's later constitutional obligation to provide his DNA.
It's a fascinating legal loop. And that exhaustive battle finally concluded in April of 2025. Mitchum's defense petitioned the U.S. Supreme Court, arguing the ruling just trampled Fourth Amendment rights.
But the Supreme Court declined to hear the case.
They did, and that cemented the Arizona Supreme Court's decision, setting the stage for the trial, a full decade after Allison's death.
The trial was the culmination of a decade of legal and forensic persistence. Jury selection began in October 2025, and opening statements followed on November 12, 2025.
And given the sheer complexity of the forensic evidence and that high-profile legal battle, the proceedings were expected to last up to 7 months.
The prosecution, having finally navigated all those legal landmines, they focused their case entirely on the indisputable forensic result.
Right. They emphasized that a lawful cheek swab, which was taken from Mitchum after his arrest under a new court order, it matched the crime scene DNA profile in every genetic marker. The evidence was presented as absolute.
DPS forensic analyst Vicki Beamer, she was a central figure in the prosecution's case, wasn't she?
She was. She provided this extensive, highly technical testimony, meticulously walking the jurors through how the full male DNA profile was obtained from those 3 usable trace samples found amid all that chlorine.
And she confirmed that rigorous contamination protocols were followed in the lab throughout the entire years-long chain of custody.
Let's walk through the trial chronology now and get into the specific pedantic scene details that were presented to that jury.
It started with the discovery.
Alex Stone, Allison's boyfriend, he was the first witness. He provided that emotional anchor, recounting the moment he found the body and testifying about that overwhelming chemical smell that hit him when he walked in.
And the prosecution played his gut-wrenching 911 call for the court, immediately establishing the trauma of that scene.
Then, first responders provided crucial context about the cleanup effort. A retired firefighter, Paul Nurl, he testified that the initial call was just dispatched as difficulty breathing.
Before being upgraded to a full homicide.
Right. And he described this unsettling, almost sterile appearance of certain parts of the home, which stood in stark contrast to the sheer violence they found centered in the hallway.
Then came the testimony from Police Command and Evidence Management. Scottsdale Police Lieutenant Hugh Lockerbie detailed the collection and the highly controversial use of that preserved 2015 blood sample that initiated the whole match.
But the defense, facing this mountain of DNA evidence, they focused their entire cross-examination on casting doubt on the investigation's integrity.
And they had a specific contamination incident to work with involving Lockerbie himself.
They did. Under cross-examination, Lockerbie was forced to admit that his own DNA had accidentally contaminated some of the evidence.
Specifically, an item that wasn't even central to the murder itself.
Correct. But it was a gift to the defense. They seized on that admission to imply a pattern of general negligence, suggesting systemic mishandling of the 400 collected pieces of evidence. They tried to undermine the entire chain of custody.
Even though the DNA analyst reaffirmed that strict protocols were followed for the three key samples,
Exactly.
but the most pedantic and technically complex testimony that came from the crime scene specialists detailing the forensic processing over those initial 5 days.
Okay, let's go deep on the clues that the cleanup itself left behind, which became their own form of evidence.
They really had to reverse engineer the cleanup process.
They did. Testimony detailed finding the three key DNA samples, the mop, the broken beer bottle neck. But a critical, very subtle clue came from the cleaning agent itself.
A detective described seeing the specific, highly unusual residue at a photo marker, PMH, located in the dining room area.
And it wasn't blood. It was a viscous, sticky type of substance, or a white yellowish crystallized substance that was just adhering to the tile floor.
What's the implication of that? Why spend so much time in a trial talking about a substance that wasn't blood?
It suggested the killer used a highly concentrated, maybe industrial-strength cleaning agent, possibly a strong lye or a specific type of chlorine compound that actually crystallized as it reacted with the environment.
Or maybe reacted with the blood that had been mopped up.
Possibly. That concentration and the fact that it was stuck to the floor, it showed the level of premeditation and effort in the cleanup. The killer wasn't just pouring some mild detergent. They were trying to completely neutralize the scene.
The investigators were truly operating under the premise that the cleanup was the crime scene.
They were. Testimony detailed seeing a white spray pattern on doorknobs in the bedroom, in the kitchen, on a laundry room cabinet, and even on Allison's car door out in the carport.
So the attacker was trying to wipe down every single surface they might have touched on their way in and their way out.
And to follow that evidence trail left by all this relentless spraying, investigators took an extraordinary measure.
They directed the collection and processing of the P-traps underneath the sinks.
The B-traps, yes, in the kitchen and the spare bathroom. They were hoping that cellular material, hair, fibers, or trace blood that had been washed down the drain might have been caught in those U-shaped pipes.
That level of detail, it just shows that the detectives recognized from the very beginning that the killer was attempting a professional-grade forensic evasion.
And the scene extended outside, too, showing the killer's path of disposal.
Testimony confirmed that a silver hoop earring, which was consistent with one Allison was wearing, and a piece of carpet with long hairs and red stains consistent with blood. They were recovered from the bottom of the swimming pool.
And that piece of carpet was particularly damning. It matched a void pattern that they observed just outside the sliding glass door.
So the theory was that the killer cut out a bloodied section of carpet, or maybe a bath mat, and just threw it in the pool,
hoping the chlorine in the water would destroy the evidence. The presence of her earring in the pool suggested she was either dragged or had struggled outside before the killer managed to subdue her or finish cleaning the interior.
And finally, there was the digital context.
Lieutenant Kevin Kwan detailed extracting the door open and closed logs from Allison's alarm system timestamps.
And that allowed the prosecution to reconstruct this very tight minute-by-minute timeline of her final night, which the DNA evidence then slotted Ian Mitchum right into.
The defense's primary strategy, facing this mountain of forensic evidence, was just systemic doubt. They pressed the DPS analysts repeatedly on lab protocols.
Potential for mixed samples, the integrity of the chain of custody over a decade.
They used Lockerbie's contamination admission to just paint this picture of generalized sloppiness.
And they also tried to pivot to an alternative suspect.
Right, Allison's pharmacist, who lived nearby and had allegedly made some incriminating statements. But the prosecution shut that down pretty quickly.
They just stressed the total absence of any physical evidence, no DNA, no fingerprints, no physical connection whatsoever, tying that individual to that brutal scene.
And the defense's lack of a credible alternative narrative, it just left them facing a 100% DNA match. And that's the definition of an uphill battle.
So regardless of the trial's final outcome, the Allison Feldman case has already achieved this kind of watershed status.
Yeah.
It really transcends the immediate criminal proceedings.
It does. It sparked a profound national debate about familial DNA, which is often labeled, controversial DNA technology.
The ethical debate is just unavoidable, and it cuts right to the heart of what we even mean by privacy in the 21st century.
And the core dilemma is pretty clear. If an innocent person's relative is in a state or federal database, should that innocent person automatically become a suspect just by genetic association?
Critics like Professor William Oding have argued very strongly that once a partial match is made, every member of that family becomes a suspect.
Which means the privacy violation isn't just targeting the eventual suspect. It's targeting the entire genetic lineage, and that has a chilling effect on their constitutional rights.
And we have to acknowledge the concerns raised by groups like the ACLU.
We do. They argue that because state databases like CODIS often contain a statistical overrepresentation of genetic data from people of color due to disproportionate sentencing and incarceration rates, those communities face a disproportionately higher risk of investigation and suspicion through these familial searches.
It raises these profound questions of equity in forensic surveillance.
But the counterpoint, which the Feldman family really embodied, is the undeniable public safety guarantee.
For families trapped in these cold cases, these tools, when they're used responsibly and with judicial oversight, they are the only way to obtain justice and remove violent offenders from society.
The challenge is always balancing the right of privacy for the many against the need for safety and justice for the victim.
Legally, the Feldman case achieved a critical clarification in Arizona. It forced a definitive ruling on the privacy of biological evidence.
Right. It confirmed, through the Arizona Supreme Court, that obtaining a DNA profile is a separate search under the Fourth Amendment, even if police lawfully possess the physical sample.
And that ruling is a significant check on unchecked government access to our biological materials.
So the court, in one ruling, it simultaneously affirmed a constitutional right that Ian Mitchum's privacy was violated, and it allowed that violation to stand because of the unique facts of the inevitable discovery doctrine.
It's a stunning example of how legal pragmatism can coexist with constitutional adherence.
And beyond the courtroom, Harley Feldman channeled his grief and his experience into advocacy. He started speaking at the Conference of Western Attorneys General, pushing other states to adopt familial DNA searching.
The Feldmans argued that these methods should be standardized and responsibly implemented to bring closure to other families who are suffering that same nightmare of uncertainty.
For the residents of Scottsdale, the case served as a reminder of the raw fear from 2015, but also as a testament to forensic persistence.
Allison's case, it effectively opened the door for new investigative methods in Arizona. It ensures that the legacy of her case is a fundamental shift in how the state handles its most intractable cold cases.
So we have completed a deep dive into the Allison Feldman case, a journey that spanned a decade, tracing a path from a brutal, chlorine-soaked crime scene in 2015 to a high-stakes murder trial in late 2025.
And the solution hinged entirely on a familial DNA search that targeted the killer's brother, which led to an illegally analyzed vial of blood that was only affirmed in court through the very complicated application of the inevitable discovery doctrine.
The quest for justice for Allison Feldman was a torturous legal and scientific tightrope walk. On one side, the Arizona Supreme Court affirmed a critical constitutional principle. You do not lose all privacy rights in your biological sample simply because the state lawfully possessed it for a different reason.
And that is a foundational legal victory for privacy advocates.
But on the other side, the very same ruling ensured that the DNA profile, which was obtained initially through that constitutional violation, could still be used to pursue justice and ensure the killer faces accountability.
It prevented a technical error from freeing a potentially dangerous suspect.
So, as the jury deliberates the fate of Ian Mitchum in early 2026, the case already leaves this indelible mark. How far is society truly willing to reach into genetic privacy, the privacy not just of a suspect but of an entire innocent family tree, to ensure justice is found in a single surviving drop of blood?
That tension between public safety and constitutional rights, driven by our ever-increasing forensic capabilities, it really remains one of the defining challenges of modern investigation.